Hello, my name is Jonathan Clark. I'm also known online as djbolivia, and the purpose of this video is to teach you a little bit about what a MIDI controller is and why it's useful. So, am I going to teach you about MIDI? No, that's too complicated. You don't need to know that for this video. Now, I am about to make a second video when I get into my music production series to talk about MIDI in a lot more depth, because in a music production environment, yes, you need to know how MIDI works, you need to know the background behind it, all that sort of stuff. That's not important for this video. I'm just going to give you a couple of very basic facts. Now, what is MIDI? Well, it stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. Again, you don't need to know that. MIDI was developed in the early 1980s because there are all these different instruments out there, you know, synthesizers and types of other equipment, that it would be really handy if they could work together better. And so it was designed as a communications protocol to allow all these different pieces of electronic equipment to work together in a music environment. Now, within the music production environment, you're going to need to know a little bit more about MIDI. Like, for instance, if you're producing dance music, MIDI is incredibly important. So what happens is, in music production, let's say that your software that you're using, it's called a DAW, or Digital Audio Workstation. But your software, no matter what it is, it could be Pro Tools, Cubase, Logic, Ableton, Reason, whatever. Most DAWs have a section in there where it's called the sequencer setup. And the sequencer, you'll see something that looks like a grid. And on that grid, you can draw in note information. And what happens is some MIDI data basically is symbolic of a stream of notes. And so if you've got that type of MIDI data, all it does is tell you how long the notes are, what pitch the notes are supposed to be, stuff like that. It's not actual audio sound. What happens is that MIDI data gets routed through your system, through whatever, and ends up in something like an external synthesizer, or an external physical sound module, or even inside the software as it's called a VSTI, Virtual Studio Technology Instrument. And a VSTI is basically like an instrument within the software. So your MIDI data gets routed to any of those things, physically outside the computer or virtually in the computer, and whatever the MIDI stream is going through, your device will play those notes. So let's say that you've got a synthesizer set up to sound like a saxophone. Those MIDI notes going through will make the synthesizer play audio files, play audio sounds that sound like a saxophone based on that stream of MIDI notes going through. Or if you've got a VSTI of a trumpet inside your laptop, you route your MIDI data through that and the sound of a trumpet will come out. Okay? So that's basically why MIDI is useful in a production environment. But ignoring all that, MIDI is also useful because it's a communication protocol to allow equipment to talk to each other. And a MIDI controller, in its simplest form, it's a physical device that sits there on the desk beside your computer, whatever. It's hooked up to your computer, and it's got all kinds of different controls on it. And the controls could be knobs, they could be sliders, they could be faders, whatever. But you can set it up so that your computer knows that that device exists, and it talks to it. And so the computer recognizes when you move a slider or when you turn a knob on that controller. And then, within your software, you can set it up. It's called MIDI mapping. And so you map certain parts of your software to the controls on that controller. Now, why do you need to map something to a controller? I know this doesn't make sense at first. Basically, think about think about using a DAW. Maybe you've got 3 or 4 sound effects that you want to be applied to your music, okay? So you've got, say a stream of piano notes coming through, and you've got a reverb effect, and you've got a phaser effect, you've got an echo effect. And you want to be able to play with all those 3 effects as your music is playing. If you try to do that with a mouse, it's impossible, because your mouse can only be in one place at one time. So you can't control all 3 of those effects simultaneously. But the neat thing is, with a controller, computers work so fast that you can twirl knobs on 2 of those 3 settings anyway, and if you're coordinated, maybe 3. If it's faders, you can certainly work 3 faders at the same time. Okay, so if those 3 faders are tied into your 3 effects in your software, you can be moving those 3 things all at the same time, and your controls within your software will all move at the same time. So now you see why an external controller is powerful, because it overcomes the limitations of working with a mouse on a computer. It gives you so much more flexibility. So a DJ may use a controller in a live performance because you may be able to set up 15 or 20 different individual controls on your controller to different effects and things within your software. Okay? All it does is make your performance a lot easier. It's intuitive, it's hands-on, you can feel what you're doing, and it's more flexible because you can work with things faster and more efficiently than you can with a mouse. Okay? So there's a lot of different types of controllers out there. You'll get controllers that look like a keyboard synthesizer, and they actually may be 2 different things in one. They may actually be a keyboard that outputs actual audio sound, but it may also have knobs and buttons up at the top that function as MIDI controls. Okay? You can have a controller that looks like a traditional DJ style sort of layout. So it might have 2 jog wheels on it that look like turntable platters, and then it may have knobs, it may have sliders set up to look like they should be the volume faders on your DJ channels. It might have knobs up top that look like they should be the EQ controls, stuff like that. So you can also have other types of controllers. You can have things, specialized controllers like the Launchpad, which is made by Novation. And that doesn't really look like any DJ controller or a keyboard. You can have the APC40 by Akai. Again, it's a specialized piece of equipment, and it's usually used with Ableton. It was designed to be used with Ableton, but it's still a generic MIDI controller, and any MIDI controller can be used with any software that accepts MIDI information. You can have things that look like foot switches. You can have all kinds of controllers. Actually, if you go online, do a Google search on, go to MOOG, M-O-O-G, MOOG Audio MIDI Controller. And MOOG is it's a company in Canada that sells electronic and music equipment. And if you do a search on MOOG Audio MIDI Controller, you'll probably see a list of about 100 different types of controllers. On each controller, you're going to have the option of different types of controls. You can have sliders or faders that just move up and down. You can have knobs that perhaps move forever in either direction. You can have knobs that kind of just go from one side to the other and then they stop. You can have optical pads. You can have joysticks or track balls. You can have jog wheels. You can have pitch bend controls, all sorts of stuff. Okay, every controller is different. And the good thing is, because they all use this MIDI communications protocol to talk, then it's a very standardized thing. So even, you know, if your software had to be designed to understand the specifics of every different type of controller out there, well, then it's a nightmare because, you know, there's thousands of different devices out there. But because they're all using this one standard, something like Ableton that, you know, I can have a version on my laptop right now and a controller that comes out 3 years from now because it's using MIDI, it can still talk to Ableton, even though it didn't even exist at the time that Ableton was released. Okay, so how do they talk to each other? Well, this is what a MIDI cord looks like. It's usually a 5-pin interface, and that type of cable is what carries MIDI signals usually in a live music or studio situation. I'm thinking, like, say you're on a concert stage and you've got synthesizers and other stuff talking to each other. Now, if you're going into a computer or out of a computer, most computers don't have MIDI ports that take this type of cord. So in that case, usually anything designed to talk to a computer will have either a USB cable interface, or less commonly, it'll have a FireWire interface. But the USB is common. And so what'll happen is, if your MIDI instrument is not also USB enabled, what you have to do is run your MIDI cable from that instrument, and it would go into an external sound card, because almost every external sound card will accept MIDI. Any good one will, anyway. And then the sound card translates that and sends it through the USB or the FireWire into the laptop. So that's how some devices will talk, some controllers will talk to your computer. More often, devices nowadays also have a USB connection built in. So the controller doesn't have to go through a sound card in that case. It can talk directly to your laptop. And so what happens is, when you start your software, you go into your audio preferences and find your MIDI section and just click. Usually there'll be a drop-down menu, and you may have to press a button that says search for MIDI device. But anyway, the software will recognize that there is some type of MIDI device hooked up to your computer. It may know the brand. Like if you go into Ableton, for instance, Ableton knows about 10 or 15 specific types, models, and brands of devices that are really designed for use in Ableton. And so Ableton will understand that it's this specific device, and it understands how to work with it. So it may give you a little bit more flexibility than some random generic device. But you also have the option, you know, if you're using a strange device which has never existed before and you plug it in, you can set it as your generic MIDI controller. And from that point on, you should be able to move controls, and the computer sees that you're moving controls on this thing. And so what would happen would be, in a general sense, you go into your MIDI mapping mode, you pick something like, say, a reverb wet dry volume within your software, and you say, I want to map this control to something on my controller. And the computer says, okay, go ahead and move the knob or button or slider, whatever, on the controller that you want attached to your effect. And then you'd go and move a slider, and the computer goes, okay, I understand. Whenever you move that slider, I'm going to move this wet dry volume on the reverb here in my software. Okay, so that's generally how it works. Very simple. So before I go any further, let's look at a few different examples of some MIDI controllers that are out there. This device is made by Novation. It's called the X-Station 49. This one is interesting because it is a combination of both a synthesizer and a controller, or a control surface. Okay, so looking at the back, we have the availability of inputs for microphone through XLR cables. We have MIDI in and outs, bit of digital signal out. There's our USB connection to go to a computer. You'll notice there's also a power switch on this. This thing will function, most devices get their power through USB if they don't have a huge power draw, huge power requirements. But this device, I believe it's only the control surface stuff that will work when you're powered through USB, and if you're going into the synthesizer aspects, you actually have to plug in that external power supply. So anyway, on this keyboard, on this controller, we have a lot of different options. For example, we have some knobs that will rotate forever. We have quite a few knobs that will only go so far in either direction. We have faders. And again, obviously you can see how you can work several faders at the same time to do real-time changes within your DAW. What else? We have notes, keys. Now the keys normally would not be used typically as control items. They'd more often be used for actual note data, but technically speaking, a key can be used as a control. For instance, if you've got a reverb in your software and you want to be able to turn it on and off, you can set it so perhaps this E key, hit it once and it turns on the reverb, hit it again, the reverb turns off. Or say you've got a sampler loaded with a bunch of samples, you can have it so that every time you press this A key, a certain specific sample plays. Okay, so the keys can be used as controls. What else? We have a joystick sort of trackball. Well, it's a trackball but with a joystick attachment. This, I believe, I haven't used this actually, but I believe this is an optical pad, and so this would be useful in effects like, say you go into Ableton and you use the auto filter. If you look there, there's a graph, a grid, and so changing the going left to right, going on the x-axis, you change the frequency for the cutoff, and going up and down on the y-axis, you change your Q value, which is your width. And so basically by using your finger on this pad, you can move your center point all over that grid within the auto filter effect. So you can control both y and x axes at the same time. Okay, so that's a good sample. This is a good example of a keyboard-based controller. Okay, here we have a unit that's a bit of a beast. Very, very nice keyboard. I love this keyboard. It's a Roland FP9 digital piano. This is not really a controller. This is a MIDI device, yes, and technically you could use the keys as on-off controls. You look at the back and you can see that it's got MIDI capabilities, but this is the sort of device that's used basically just as an instrument, not as a controller. So not all keyboards are controllers. Okay, so this device is actually a DJ mixer first and foremost. It's by Allen and Heath. It's called the Zone 4D. You can see it does have MIDI connections on the back, and it's got USB, so this is the that's how you would end up hooking it up to your computer, your laptop system. Basically the way this is designed, it's kind of an audio mixer first and foremost in the middle, but it has MIDI controls on it, all kinds of MIDI controls, so it's very versatile. It's got a whole row up here at the top of knobs that will spin forever in either direction, but they also have push functions, and there's a couple more down here. We have two rows here of other pot knobs which only go, they're limited in their in how far they can go either way. We have all kinds of faders, sliders. We have a ton of additional push buttons, on-off push buttons here. And we have some push buttons down at the bottom which light up when they're on or off. And finally we have a couple of jog wheels. So very versatile, all kinds of choices on this controller. And I actually have a separate video to talk about the this Allen and Heath controller. Very, very useful in a professional environment. Okay, here we have the APC40, which is a controller designed specifically for use with Ableton software. It's made by Akai. And looking at the back, we've got our power supply. There's our USB connection, so that's how it talks to the computer. Now I've actually got a separate video on this unit, on the APC40, because this is it's a really good device if you're performing with Ableton, like DJing or whatever. Basically, this sets up, if you had, say, 8 channels going in Ableton, this allows you to launch clips for the top 5 rows of those 8 channels. You can launch your scenes. Down here you can go with these would be your track activator buttons, this would be your solo cue buttons, this would be your record arm buttons, and you'd probably have these assigned, this is how it defaults, the assignments. Of course you can remap stuff. And then these faders, sliders, would all be assigned normally to your track channel volumes. Over here we have all kinds of track controls for send returns and stuff like that, your tap tempo, cue level if you're cueing, and your master output. We've got all these device control knobs, So for instance, say you had a reverb in each track and all of them had their wet dry assigned to channel 2, then you can use this control to adjust your reverb in any track. And you might have it so it's like the reverb is on 2, you might have a delay echo on 3, you might have a beat repeat on 4, a phaser on 5, a flanger on 6, a ping pong on 7, etc. So you can control a whole lot of stuff with this as you're selecting scenes and bringing the volumes in and out. And of course there's a crossfader on it, global start stop, stuff like this. Very, very versatile unit. Like I say, I've got a separate video for this if you're curious. Works great with Ableton if you're doing live DJ performances. Okay, so here we have another example of a standard generic MIDI controller. This one is the Numark Mixtrack controller, and it's powered by USB, as you can see. Now this one, the USB cord's actually tied directly into the unit, so it's not removable. Pros and cons to that. The drawback, of course, if you destroy the cord somehow, you can't just replace it with another cord. But, of course, there is an advantage because it's pretty hard to lose the cord. See, there's what a standalone cord would look like. Anyway, this controller is kind of the traditional decks and mixer layout, which is found in a fairly large number of controllers nowadays. Basically, this controller will integrate with different software packages directly, already programmed to do so. So I believe it comes with Virtual DJ, the Lite edition, in North or South America. But if you buy this in Europe or Asia, it comes with the Traktor Lite edition. And so all the different packages, Virtual DJ, Traktor, Serato, they're all kind of tailored to work with a controller that has this sort of layout as an especially good sort of layout. It doesn't have to be used with those packages. It can also be used as a generic MIDI controller with anything. So this will work with Ableton, although it's not really tied into Ableton specifically. If you do use it with the other packages, the ones that it comes with, all these controls will light up, which kind of looks cool, but if you do use it with something like Ableton, you won't necessarily get all the lights and stuff like that, but you can still use it. So with a package like Traktor or Virtual DJ, it does function very much like a traditional audio mixer. You've got your channel gains for the left and right channel, crossfader, you've got a master gain for the overall effect. And I should mention this crossfader is actually a different type of fader than the other three, because this one is a lot faster to move. All the other faders on this have a little bit more resistance on them. Anyway, it has what would double as EQ controls, and you can use this in the Virtual DJ software, etc., to go through your browser, and if you browse down to a song that you like, you can press a load button and it loads it onto one side in the software, not physically in this unit. Remember, this is just an external controller. So these EQ controls would control the settings within the software. We have Q gain up top and the Q mix ratio down here. We have play, start, stop buttons, sync buttons, stutter buttons to go with each jack, and of course you can scratch on the jog wheels. We have pitch control, again tied into the software, and various hot cue and looping controls. So that's a lot of that stuff, you know, all the buttons are labeled hot cue, delete, effect, manual, etc. That's because they're labeled specifically when they're being used with those software packages. But of course, if you use this as a generic controller with a program like Ableton, you can assign all this stuff to anything. So basically with Ableton, I might want to set it up exactly like a DJ mixer style, but I might also want to set things so that different knobs control, you know, completely random things. Like this might control the wet dry on a flanger instead of me assigning it to a mid EQ range. Okay, so that's basically how this all works. The USB power, well, the unit is powered through USB. This one does not need an external power supply, and in fact it doesn't have that option anyway. Let me see what else. The dimensions, it's about 19 inches wide, 11 inches high, top to bottom, 2 inches high off the desk. It weighs around just over 4 pounds if you're American. For the rest of the world, it's just under 2 kilograms, so it's kind of light, pretty easy to move around. Now there is another Numark product called the Mixtrack Pro, or the Mixtrack Pro 2, which are a little bit different than this one. Those Mixtrack Pros are heavier because they also incorporate an audio sound card into things. So still hooks up to the computer by USB, but the Mixtrack Pro has 2 pairs of RCA outputs. So one would go to your dance floor, your sound system, one would go to your booth monitor, and then there's also ports for for your headphones, for your cueing capabilities, and a port for a 1/4-inch microphone jack in case you want to talk over the music. Okay, so that's a little bit more high-end than this one. Exactly the same layout. And yeah, so there's a lot of controllers nowadays that are set up like this, which have that, 2 decks, 1 deck on each side, and basically set up exactly like a DJ mixer. So you're going to see lots of things with a similar sort of layout to this. This one seems to work pretty well. So the next several clips you're going to see were filmed in the Long McQuade store in Moncton, New Brunswick, Canada. Long McQuade is a Canadian distributor of all things musical, equipment, instruments, and a friend of mine, Mark Taylor, who has worked at Long McQuade Moncton for many, many years, has agreed to help out with this video. So he's showing us some equipment from a couple of different product lines, and most of the things you'll see in the next few minutes are basically laid out like DJ controllers. So we're starting out with the Typhoon by Vestax. I wasn't sure about the colors when it first came out of the box, but once I looked at it up closely, I kind of like it, and I guess design is nice. Basically, you'll see the same layout as most DJ setups. The knobs, faders, all that sort of stuff. Well, the faders up at the top have a lot more resistance than the ones down at the bottom on the crossfader and on the channel volumes. That's typical of units in this product category. This particular item also has a built-in sound card. We're going to look at the front in a second here, and you'll see that there's 2 1/4-inch inputs. The one on the left that you see right here is for a microphone input, so that's an input sensitivity knob, the red knob right beside it. Over here on the right we have the insert for your headphones, and of course the volume control. And on the back some other sound card controls, including the master out. Moving on, we have the Numark IDJ Pro. Now you can see that the box shows an iPad. It does not include the iPad. You have to plug your own in. There's also an IDJ3, which will hook up to your iPhone or your iPad. So in any of these units, the iDevice provides your sound. And this is laid out like another generic DJ style MIDI controller. Nice record spider design in the center of the platter there. Numark owns a lot of stuff now. Numark is owned by Jack O'Donnell of InMusic. He bought Alesis in 2001. They used to have some nice compressors, 3630 compressors. I have a couple of those I like. He bought Akai in 2004. They make the APC40. He bought M Audio from Avid in 2012. So they've got a lot of reach. Anyway, the only drawback possibly with these is the quality of the sound files if you're going through iTunes. So you might want to try to use AIF files or other higher quality files if you're using this kind of an IDJ3 unit. And finally, we're going to take a look at the Traktor series. We're going to look at the S2, although right now we're zooming in on the box for the S4. The S4 has 4 channels. You can see that on the graphic on the box. The S2 that we're going to look at only has 2 channels. Made by Native Instruments. It's got an integrated sound card, as you can probably guess from all these controls on the side of it. Native Instruments, they were well known a number of years ago. They partnered with Stanton for a while, 2003 to 2006, and worked on the Final Scratch systems, which were pretty innovative, pretty unique. I enjoyed those. I played with Final Scratch quite a bit. Native Instruments, also well known because it produces a number of soft synths and samplers such as Absynth, FM8, Contact, Massive. You'll recognize those names if you're into music production. They're all workhorses in the production industry. Anyway, another standard DJ controller. And one last thing I'm going to show you here right now. This is not actually a controller. This is an external sound card. It is the Roland OctaCapture. But I did mention that sometimes your controllers may not talk direct. They may not have a USB interface. They may not talk directly to your computer. But you might be able to hook them up through the MIDI cables into your external sound card, and then your external sound card, because it has the USB connection, then the sound card will talk to the computer. Okay, so now that I've showed you a half dozen examples of controllers, hopefully you've got a basic idea what they can look like. Remember, don't be limited by what I've shown you. There are literally thousands of different types of controllers out there. They can look absolutely nothing at all like some of the stuff that I've showed you, okay? And of course, hopefully by now you understand why they exist. If you are working with software in a computer, you just literally cannot control a whole bunch of stuff quickly with just a mouse. So an external controller gives you the flexibility to control a whole lot of stuff at the same time in real time. So it just makes life easier. Doesn't matter if you're performing a concert on a stage, if you're a DJ trying to mix music, stuff like that. Controllers can be used in all kinds of situations. Okay, and be aware that MIDI is used for a lot more than just having a controller talk to your computer. You know, it is used in music production, and that's a lot more complicated subject. Maybe you'll be interested in looking at that someday. Okay, so if you've got any questions about this, post them underneath my video on YouTube, or even better, if it's going to be a complicated question or a complicated answer, please post it on my Facebook page, because I could write out a lot longer reply. And I will try to answer all questions, obviously. Okay, so thanks very much for watching, and hopefully you'll get a chance to check out some of my other tutorial videos about DJing and music production and audio recording, all that stuff on my YouTube channel. Cheers!